That is what they have shared with us.
A very good morning. Very good morning to colleagues and friends where it is still in the morning, and a very good afternoon to those of us on this side where we have already started the afternoon. I wish to welcome once again colleagues, members of the Commission, staff of the Secretariat, interpreters. I also wish to welcome to this seventh day of the session of the Commission to our distinguished delegates of states parties, national human rights institutions, and civil society organizations. It is a pleasure to have you all participating in this 67th ordinary session. Yesterday, we had a full day dealing with one of the most important agenda items for our ordinary session, involving the review of the state report of the Republic of Cameroon. A report that was submitted within the framework of Articles 62 of the African Charter, 26 of the Maputo Protocol, and 14 of the Kampala Convention. As have been highlighted yesterday, I think it's a very welcome development for which we commend Cameroon, that we have a state that submitted a report under the Kampala Convention on the protection of the rights of internally displaced persons. The review presented us a unique opportunity to engage in a more in-depth interactive dialogue with the delegation of the Republic of Cameroon, and also review the state of human rights in Cameroon, not only in the context of the report, which is a combined report covering quite a number of years, but also the current state of affairs in Cameroon. I wish in this respect to once again reiterate the commendation of the Commission for Cameroon for affording us that opportunity for us to engage directly on some of the most pressing human rights issues for us to address jointly and support the effort for ensuring that human rights are duly respected and protected at all times in all conditions. I also wish to thank my colleagues, members of the Commission, for the presentation of very pertinent questions relating to their portfolio and covering various aspects of the rights provided for in the African Charter. We also had another agenda item that related to a panel on enforced disappearances, during which we received insights from members of the panel. I wish to thank them again, to thank in particular Commissioner Guy as the chairperson for putting together for presenting the panel, and also doing so in collaboration with the UN working group on this subject matter, and the exchange, rich exchange, including the exposure to the public of the work that the Commission has done in elaborating guidelines in respect of enforced disappearances. Today, we would shift gear once again, focusing on agenda item 4, which relates to the state of human rights in Africa. And in that respect, we will be receiving statements from states parties to the African Charter on Human and people's rights, national human rights institutions, and civil society organizations. So colleagues in Banjul, I have received the request from state parties, but I really wish that you send us the updated list of requests from NHRs and civil society organizations, please. But for now, while waiting to receive that, may I request if we have the delegation of the state of Eritrea for presenting the statement of Eritrea. Okay, I think we have the representative of the state of Eritrea to present the statement.
Mr. Chairperson.
Yes.
Mr. Chairperson.
Yes.
The statement will be delivered by His Excellency Ambassador Tasfa Mikhail Garahtu. So I would rather that you give him the floor. It seems like the host has made me panelist. So to shift to Ambassador Garahtu.
Edwell, if you could assist to actually, if you could locate Ambassador Tasfa Mikhail. Okay, we have, okay. Great. Thank you, Biniam, for that. It looks like that we are having difficulty connecting with Ambassador Tasfa Mikhail of the state of Eritrea. Yeah.
So they said this is the list of speakers who are still waiting to speak since the beginning of the session. So they are waiting online and they've not had their turn. And that is why this list has been presented.
Okay, we are trying to establish contact with Ambassador Mikhail. If you kindly bear with us, I think we are making progress. That's the indication I'm getting from our technical team.
Mr. Chairperson, Commissioner Solomon, I am ready if everything is fine.
Okay. Is it possible to have the video on? Okay. You are very welcome, Ambassador. Please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It gives me a great pleasure to address the 67th ordinary session of the African Commission for Human and People's Rights on behalf of the government of the state of Eritrea. The state of Eritrea ushered in the year 2020 with a clear vision and renewed vigor to expedite the all-round development drive of the country. Looking back at the 10 months that elapsed, we are heartened by the fact that the momentum is sustained while combating significant unforeseen challenges, most notably the global COVID-19 pandemic and the locust invasion in the Horn of Africa region. Taking into account the disastrous impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, Eritrea took preventive measures even before the first case was diagnosed in the country, and afterwards embarked on a pragmatic approach to cut and abort the transmission in the case of the first outbreak by ensuring the mobilization, organization, and creation of national capacity, including communal support initiatives to vulnerable groups. Thanks to the exemplary efforts of the government and the full participation of the Eritrean people at home and abroad, Eritrea has contained the COVID-19 pandemic. To date, 527 persons have tested positive for COVID-19, of whom 456, about 87%, have fully recovered and with no COVID-19 related fatality. There hasn't been community-level transmission of the disease in Eritrea so far. All the cases were found among people who flew into Eritrea a few days before the suspension of flights and others who irregularly traveled back from the neighboring countries after the closure of the country's international boundaries. The government instituted preventive measures, including stay-at-home directive, but critical sectors and projects, including agriculture and food security, water conservation and supply infrastructure, essential productive sectors, infrastructure development, health services, and the financial sector continued unhindered. The government relaxed the lockdown measures gradually while continuing to ensure adherence to COVID-19 prevention procedures. Similarly, Eritrea is making continuous effort to control desert locust swarms from neighboring countries and those breeding locally. So far, no significant crop or rangeland damage has occurred, but the effort continues as more swarms are forecasted to arrive. Mr. Chairman, the new dynamics of peace and friendship between Eritrea and Ethiopia, which came into effect through the joint declaration on peace and friendship of July 9, 2018, and the agreement on peace, friendship, and comprehensive cooperation signed on 16 September 2018, has revitalized and broadened areas of cooperation at bilateral and regional levels. At present, priority is given to consolidate peace, create complementarity, and lay down the requisite infrastructural and administrative legal frameworks to enhance cooperation. While the political goodwill and progress registered so far is encouraging, we are cognizant of the fact that building durable peace is a process that requires time and concerted efforts. Yet, it is important to note that there are local and external actors with vested interests bent on derailing or impeding the peace and cooperation. Mr. Chairman, Eritrea has declared a new development paradigm that aims at rebuilding national efforts to create macroeconomic growth and stability, strengthen the institutional and organizational basis, and consolidate the political process of nation building. Despite the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic, the 2019-2020 transitional program is being implemented with the aim of consolidating social justice predicated on the fundamental principles of equal rights and opportunities sanctioned by the Eritrean national law. Mainstreaming of human rights has remained central in Eritrea's national development program and resulted in tangible progress even during the challenging 2 decades of declared war and other existential threats during 1998-2018. The mainstreaming of human rights is further strengthened by the ongoing effort to consolidate the infrastructure for the follow-up and reporting of international and regional commitments. The African Commission for Human and People's Rights recommendations from the last reporting cycle have been incorporated in the sector plans, and Eritrea's periodic report covering 2017 to 2020 is being compiled and slated for submission in April 2021. Moreover, the government of Eritrea has responded to a letter of appeal by the former chairperson of the working group on indigenous population and communities. Like any other country, Eritrea faces challenges in the protection of human rights, which the government continuously works to address. It's committed to dignified engagement and cooperation predicated on mutual respect, understanding, and benefit, while strongly opposing the politicization of human rights and confrontational approaches. Eritrea values the ACHPR's effort and contributions in the promotion of human rights and reaffirms its commitment to further strengthen its engagement and cooperation with the Commission, inter alia, through submitting periodic reports and responses and active participation in the sessions and engagement with the relevant commissioners. Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, I wish to reiterate our call on the Commission to verify allegations and give due consideration to Eritrea's reports and the various submissions, and not rely on baseless allegations peddled by persons and organizations harboring ulterior political motives and ill intent, including futile regime change agendas in the pretext of human rights. Lack of serious action in this regard has the risk of negating the lofty ideals and the principles of the Banjul Charter and undermining the Commission's mandate in advancing human rights. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Tesfaye Mikhail, for presenting the statement of the state of Eritrea on the state of human rights in Eritrea, providing us updates on measures that have been taken by the state of Eritrea, particularly in respect to the COVID-19 pandemic, focusing on preventive measures and also ensuring that essential functioning of the economy being unhindered. And also, of course, we take note of the difficulty that Eritrea, but also other countries in the region have experienced as far as the locust invasion is concerned, and the threat that it poses for food security, and the measures that have been taken in order to contain the locust invasion and the continuing threat that it poses actually for food security. We also take note of the other areas of engagement that have been highlighted in your statement in respect of the human rights efforts. I think the observations that you have made as far as the work of the Commission is concerned, we have taken due note of those observations. I think it warrants that the Commission reiterates the position that it undertakes its activities within the parameters of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, with the view for enabling member states for them to deliver on the obligations that they have subscribed to under the African Charter, bearing in mind that member states or states parties are the primary holders of obligations, and therefore the attention from the side of the Commission always therefore focusing on them being able to deliver on their obligations. Of course, doing so within the parameters of the African Charter, following the well-established processes, and of course always striving to ensure that we do so on the basis of reports that are well substantiated and evidence-based. We thank you once again, Ambassador. We appreciate, as usual, the participation of the State of Eritrea, and we would like you to take the various issues that may be raised in the context of our activities in respect of the situation of human rights in Eritrea, from a perspective of basically the Commission trying to bring to your attention some of the issues that were brought to the attention of the Commission. And of course, wherever there are errors or mistakes, we indeed make sure that those are corrected. Thank you once again, Ambassador. And we will now turn. I don't think that we have any other requests for the floor from states parties to the African Charter. We therefore go back to the list of NHRIs and civil society organizations that have registered under agenda item 4. Let me check if we have the Commission for Human Rights of Burkina Faso. Do we have the representative of the Commission for Human Rights of Burkina Faso? We don't have? Okay. How about the National Commission for Human Rights and Liberties of Cameroon? Okay, it looks like that we do not have the representative of the National Commission for Human Rights and Liberties of Cameroon. How about the Independent National Human Rights Commission of Burundi? Okay. May I also check if we have the Commission for Human Rights and Good Governance of Tanzania? No? Okay. That is what I have on the list of NHRIs. So let me move to non-governmental organizations. The one I have is if we can get the Africa Center for Democracy and Human Rights Studies. do we have the representative of the Africa Center for Democracy and Human Rights Studies? This is the institute, the NGO with observer status number 14. I understand to be represented by Njai Mole Lashen. Okay, I think we have confirmation. In the meantime, as we...
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Welcome and kindly take the floor. Please note that you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairperson. Monsieur le Président de la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme, Monsieur Solomon Drosso, Monsieur le Vice-président de la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et du peuple, Monsieur Lumbo Ngoy, Messieurs, Mesdames les commissaires, Messieurs, chers invités distingués, chers collègues de la société civile. La pandémie de Covid-19 et les mesures prises par les États face à cette situation représentent un ensemble de menaces pour les défenseurs des droits humains. Dans les pays de l'Afrique du Nord, où les autorités violent les droits humains bien avant la pandémie, la crise a fourni un nouveau prétexte pour continuer à fouler ou piller ces droits et attaquer les défenseurs des droits humains et les individus considérés comme des opposants. Il a encore plus mis en lumière la nature politique des détentions des défenseurs abusivement emprisonnés avant la pandémie. En effet, alors que des milliers de prisonniers à travers le globe se voient accorder la libération anticipée conditionnelle ou temporaire en raison des risques liés au Covid-19. Dans les prisons surpeuplées, un grand nombre de défenseurs a été exclu de ce programme et reste injustement derrière les barreaux, subissant ainsi une sanction supplémentaire pour leur militantisme. La pandémie a davantage permis au gouvernement d'harceler et d'intimider ses détracteurs et les défenseurs des droits humains. Des législations d'urgence adoptées les a conférées de pouvoirs exceptionnels pour affronter la crise. Celles-ci punissant la création, la propagation de diffusion des fausses informations, de 2 mois maximum de prison et lourde amende. Des bureaux nationaux d'enquête ont ainsi convoqué des personnes qui avaient critiqué la réaction du gouvernement à la pandémie pour avoir supposément partagé des fausses nouvelles relatives au Covid-19. Des policiers et les autorités locales ont abattu les manifestants et les personnes qui remettent à cause des décisions gouvernementales cause des troubles dans le contexte de crise. Il a encouragé les représailles à l'encontre des défenseurs des droits humains et des détracteurs et des médias indépendants. Des journalistes ont été déclarés coupables de diffamation en ligne, tandis que la population se bat contre la répercussion du Covid-19. Les autorités ont adopté des législations anti-terrorisme comprenant une définition générale et vague du terrorisme, selon lesquelles même les critiques les plus modérées peuvent être considérées comme une action terroriste. Des journalistes ont été appréhendés par les forces de sécurité, contraints et supprimés les images qu'ils avaient enregistrées pour les documentaires qu'ils préparaient. La liberté politique, notamment celle concernant la vie associative, évalue à des rythmes très différents en fonction des pays d'Afrique. Souvent, l'exercice des droits de la réunion d'association dans un pays est lié à la qualité de la vie démocratique. Les pays d'Afrique du Nord, pour la plupart, sont reconnus pour leur mépris des droits de l'homme des mouvements associatifs. Recommandations de la CEDH, la Commission indépendante des droits de l'homme, aux membres concernant les lignes directrices de la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et du peuple. Dans plusieurs pays, les garanties constitutionnelles portent sur la liberté d'association et les réunions sont souvent compromises par l'adoption de certaines lois. Souvent, il s'agit de loi contre la calomnie, de diffamation et inflige des sanctions sévères qui prétendent y infliger la politique. L'Internet et les réseaux sociaux ont accru la capacité de la société civile à exprimer son opinion. Cependant, certaines libertés publiques semblent de plus en plus mises en péril dans les univers numériques. Ces derniers est fréquemment soumis à de nouvelles dispositions juridiques qui lui sont souvent néfastes. À l'endroit du gouvernement de l'Afrique du Nord, le gouvernement des pays où il existe les commissions nationales des droits de l'homme ont reçu la recommandation de passer en revue de façon prioritaire de champs d'action ainsi la limitation des mécanismes de protection et de promotion des droits de l'homme existe déjà dans leur pays. Ceci permettra de déterminer s'il faut des institutions supplémentaires pour atteindre le but. Conformément à la loi, il faut accorder à la Commission le pouvoir de prendre des décisions d'enquête et de faire appliquer la loi, notamment le pouvoir d'amener des investigations tout indépendantes, d'avoir librement accès aux témoins, aux documents liés, de demandes de coopération d'autres agences gouvernementales, de fixer des priorités sans aucune restriction de la part des autres agences gouvernementales et confier aux autorités compétentes de la poursuite au pénal des acteurs de violation des droits de l'homme. La CDH recommande aux commissions des droits de l'homme de chercher en permanence à remplir plus.
Mr. Naji,
Yes.
I don't want to interrupt you, but if you could please conclude.
Okay. Yes. À l'endroit de la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples, la Commission indépendante des droits de l'homme a recommandé à la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples une approche plus nuancée et axée sur la sensibilisation plutôt que de lancer des appels généraux à tous les gouvernements africains pour qu'ils créent des institutions nationales des droits de l'homme en toutes circonstances. Merci beaucoup.
Many thanks for your statement. And I think some of the issues that you have highlighted, those relating to human rights issues arising in the context of enforcing COVID-19 regulations, the various attacks against human rights defenders and journalists, the instrumentalization of anti-terrorism law, leading to the stifling of freedom of expression, and also the various other issues that you have highlighted in terms of the guidelines of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And I wish to, of course, indicate to all participants and draw your attention to the resolution of the Commission in respect of COVID-19 and the expectations and requirements of the African Charter for a strict observation of human rights standards, even in the context of COVID-19, which also addresses, among others, some of the issues that this statement highlighted. We thank you for that. I understand that there is also, I need to check whether some of the other national human rights institutions are with us in this respect. May I also confirm if we have the representative of CNDH of Mali. This is the National Human Rights Institution with affiliate status, number 21. Do we have the representative of the CNDH of Mali? Here it is indicated that it would be Agwebu Boare. It doesn't look like that there is. Okay. How about the National Human Rights Commission of Nigeria? Do we have a representative of the National Human Rights Commission of Nigeria? Okay, no indication if we have the representative of the National Human Rights Commission of Nigeria. May I ask colleagues, members of the Secretariat, to kindly notify the national human rights institutions that haven't as yet made their statements to be on standby, please, and to so that we give them the opportunity for them to make their statements. Let me go back to the list of NGOs, and I wish to call upon the Federation FIDH. If we have Mr. Andrew Songa, this is the NGO with observer status number 22. As we establish contact with Mr. Andrew Songa, may I also request the representative of Human Rights Watch, Ms. Karen Nantulia, to be on standby as well. Okay, we have Mr. Andrew Songa with us. Mr. Andrew, you have 5 minutes, please. Welcome.
Thank you. Honorable Commissioner, Honorable Chairperson, Commissioners, State Delegates, National Human Rights Institutions, and my other fellow participants. The International Federation for Human Rights appreciates the opportunity to address you on this occasion of your 67th ordinary session. Honorable Commissioners, we are still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and in the face of this adversity, we have seen some of the best instances of African solidarity and innovation. African civil society and the ordinary citizenry have come together to provide food, medical, and other emergency supplies to the most vulnerable in society. While African governments, through the coordination of the African Union, have worked to secure much-needed medical supplies through enhancing production capacities and supply chains, and continue to negotiate stimulus packages and a collective roadmap for economic recovery for the continent. However, alongside these initiatives of innovation and solidarity, we have also seen and must call attention to significant governance deficits and human rights abuses that have been encountered during this period. Numerous reports of corruption in relation to utility of COVID-19 relief funds have emerged. Therefore, we commend the recent joint statement on corruption and COVID-19 that was issued by the Commission and the African Union Advisory Board on Corruption, and insist that states ensure transparency and accountability in the use of COVID-19 relief funds, put in place procurement processes that are open, competitive, and in line with relevant laws, ensure value for money in terms of quality and efficiency, and ensure that all instances of corruption are comprehensively investigated, prosecuted, and misappropriated funds duly recovered. Honorable Commissioners, we remain concerned by the continued reports of the unjustified use of force by law enforcement officials that has resulted in the loss of lives, as well as numerous cases of inhuman and degrading treatment. We particularly call attention to the tragic Lekki tollgate massacre in Nigeria. We call on the Commission to be seized of this matter and demand that Nigerian authorities undertake transparent investigations with a view to ensuring that perpetrators are held accountable and that the victims of the massacre receive holistic redress. Furthermore, we call on the Nigerian authorities to commit to comprehensive security sector reform so as to eliminate the culture of impunity and entrench rights-based policing. Honorable Commissioners, FIDH is dismayed to note that the concerns it raised during the 66th ordinary session in relation to elections in Africa have come to pass. In Guinea's recently concluded presidential elections, our member organization has documented internet blackouts, undue restriction to public protests, the disproportionate use of force by security forces that has resulted in numerous injuries and death, and arbitrary arrests and illegal detentions. Underpinning all these violations is a presidential election result with serious credibility questions as seen in the reports of multiple independent observers. In the Côte d'Ivoire election, our member organization has documented at least 8 deaths and numerous serious injuries, various episodes of civil unrest across the country. Various independent election observers found the election neither credible nor complete, and the political crisis in the country has since escalated to the point of the opposition attempting to establish alternative platforms of political authority. In Tanzania, the conditions under which the elections were conducted have resulted in unjustified clampdown on public protests and civic space generally, the clampdown on communication channels, including the internet, and reports of civilian and opposition candidates being subjected to torture, brutality, and even death at the hands of the police and the military. We identify with the findings of the independent observer group Tanzania Election Watch, which conclude that the absence of transparency, stakeholder consultations, and accountability in the electoral process served to undermine the credibility of these elections. We strongly condemn the undue restrictions to democratic space and the various grievous acts of human rights violations that have occurred before, during, and after these elections. We acknowledge the Commission is seized of these situations, and we call on the concerned state parties to refrain from any further acts that violate or unduly restrict human rights and fundamental freedoms, and to immediately release individuals arbitrarily detained or arrested. Honorable Commissioners, as the African Union goal of silencing the guns must remain high on the agenda, we take note of the tragic developments.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I'll give you a few seconds for you to wrap up, please.
We take note of the tragic developments in Ethiopia and insist that state authorities embrace inclusive dialogue as a way out of the unfolding crisis, and to establish a comprehensive roadmap for addressing the underlying grievances and creating conditions for peace, security, and democratic and socioeconomic transformation. Honorable Commissioners, let me conclude by reiterating our warmest compliments and assuring you of our support as you discharge your mandate and promote and protect human and people's rights. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Andrew Songa, Federation for Human Rights. We take note of the points that have been highlighted in respect of governance deficits and human rights violations in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also outside of that. And indeed, as you rightly pointed out, and we appreciate that, the Commission has indeed been seized with and continues to be seized with many of the issues, almost all of the issues that you have highlighted, in respect of which the Commission actually have already pronounced itself almost in all of them, whether in respect of in respect of Nigeria, whether it is in the context of the elections in Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, and Tanzania, or in relation to the situation in Ethiopia. And the Commission, of course, continues to be seized with these situations and indeed call on all state parties that the call by the Commission in respect of each of these situations are heeded in order to ensure that human and people's rights are respected in all of these situations. Thank you once again. May I now give the floor to Human Rights Watch, please? Okay, great. You are welcome, and you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Honorable Chairperson, honorable commissioners, it's an honor to be with you all today. Human Rights Watch welcomes this opportunity to address the African Commission on Human and People's Rights on the state of human rights in Africa, especially in light of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the holding of national elections in more than a dozen African countries. Some of the elections are being held in countries already gripped by serious humanitarian and human rights crisis, notably the Central African Republic, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Burkina Faso. We are particularly concerned about ongoing violence as well as the lack of accountability for mass executions allegedly committed by state security forces in Mali and Burkina Faso. In Tanzania and Uganda, authorities stepped up repression of opposition party members, civil society organizations, and the media ahead of elections in both countries. Since October 2019, we have also documented how Tanzanian police and intelligence state agents working in collaboration with Burundian authorities allegedly arrested, disappeared, tortured, extorted, or forcibly returned 18 Burundian refugees and asylum seekers. And of course, in Ethiopia, the recent crisis is only the latest manifestation of unrest, with heavy fighting reported between regional and federal forces. Access restriction in the Tigray region, likely to only broaden the risk to the population living in Tigray and to others throughout the country. In Guinea, the period following October 18 to 2020, presidential election has been marred by violence and repression. Cameroon's Anglophone regions, violent clashes between separatist groups and the government forces and attacks on civilians by both sides continued to lead to serious human rights abuses. Nigeria, Human Rights Watch has called for an end to the use of excessive force by security forces against protesters, calling for an end to police brutality across the country. Regarding COVID-19, African governments should urgently address healthcare deficiency to meet the demands of the COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing healthcare needs of their population. And as the chairperson aptly put it, economic, social, and cultural rights are not commodities. They're part and parcel of Africa's governance framework. In South Africa and Kenya, the lockdowns to slow the spread of the virus exposed existing weaknesses in efforts of authorities to protect women, girls, and others from gender-based violence. And in Cameroon, there hasn't been enough transparency by the government with regard to the disbursement of funds it collected to address the COVID-19 pandemic. Honorable commissioners, we also note the positive progress in the operationalization of the Special Criminal Court in the Central African Republic and the transitional justice policy at the African Union. We take this opportunity to highlight the importance of advancing justice for serious crimes committed in violation of international law and the need for the African Commission to ensure and work towards the African Union and African states fully seizing opportunities to promote access to credible justice for victims. We therefore call on the African Commission to urge all states across Africa, notably Tanzania, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Liberia, Guinea, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, Mali, Nigeria, to initiate prompt, independent, impartial investigations into allegations of human rights violations, including destruction of property, killings, extrajudicial killings, torture, enforced disappearances, sexual violence, and other abuses committed by members of the security forces. Ensure respect and protection for the right to regular, free, fair, credible elections, as well as the right to peaceful protest and assembly, and ensure review and implementation of the various reports on judicial and security sector reform. Ensure transparency in the management of COVID-19 response funds and make meaningful investments to improve access to quality healthcare. For instance, call upon all African governments to come and fully support the India and South Africa's proposal to relax and waive regulations around intellectual property, some of those rules to allow more freedom to collaborate and to manufacture the vaccines and medicines. Ensure national and local COVID-19 response plans address the ways women and girls have been uniquely impacted by the pandemic, and to develop appropriate responses in consultation with women, girls, women's rights organizations to allocate the necessary resources. And finally, move forward with the implementation of accountability mechanisms, including the establishment of the hybrid court for South Sudan and those agreed upon in the context of long-standing conflicts, intercommunal violence, mass atrocities, to ensure perpetrators are fairly held to account. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Karin, for also delivering the statement within the 5 minutes timeline. We take note of the various cases of human rights issues that you have highlighted in the context of, again, some of them election context, others outside of election context, perhaps in the context of conflict. And also human rights issues in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic as well. I wish to indeed echo some of the points, particularly those relating to the imperative for a thorough, transparent, and independent investigation into alleged violations, acts of violations by security forces in a number of countries. This is basically a reiteration of the Commission's various statements in relation to the various country situations. And all of these actually highlight one very important point, that has to do with the need for a very comprehensive security sector reform, as well as judicial reform, in order to strengthen and enhance the national infrastructure for compliance with human rights standards. The issue of the rights of women and girls and their protection is something that has been a recurrent theme, which indeed requires the most urgent and highest attention in order to address the vulnerabilities of women and girls to attacks and violence. Thank you once again. I will have one last input statement before we move to the next agenda item. And this has to do with somebody by, okay, we have OMCT, SOS Torture. This is the NGO with observer status 52. I think we have the representative here with us. You have the floor, please. 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, distinguished commissioners, and state delegates. The World Organization Against Torture and its SOS Torture Network in Africa thank the African Commission on Human and People's Rights for this opportunity to raise some of the key issues with respect to the human rights situation in Africa. We would like to first commend the Commission for being one of the rare treaty body that continues to operate, review state reports, give access to civil society in this very complex pandemic. This is an opportunity that is not given before other treaty bodies. So this is something we would like to emphasize and thank you. In this year, the African states have been threatened like the rest of the world by an ongoing pandemic. While most of the states have taken preventive measures based on their duty to protect human rights and ensure that they operate in a safe and enabling environment, one have documented numerous attacks, threats, judicial harassment, restrictive laws, torture and ill treatment adopted in the framework of state of emergencies, and that irreversibly have impeded human rights. Human rights defenders have faced a huge impact given that they try to denounce some of these abuses. The pandemic has exposed the issue of prison overcrowded in detention facilities, one of the questions that the Commission has constantly qualified as a violation of the Article 5 of the Charter. It appeared that many prisons across the continent did not meet the standard to preserve social distancing as recommended by the World Organization for Health. This has led to contamination of hundreds of inmates and death of some others. We can regret the fact that most of the states did not favor the release of prisoners that were accused of petty offenses to protect their health and life. Mr. Chairperson, we would like to raise the situation of migrants in Africa that are still victims of torture. This issue is receiving less and less attention despite the repeating dramas and human rights violations that they face on their route towards Europe. The OMCT would like to highlight the generous face of torture as both a cause of forced migration, but also one of the worst crimes that migrants can face while crossing various African countries in the hope of reaching Europe. We are aware of all the efforts made by the Commission to tackle this issue, and we would like the Commission to continue pushing for a fact-finding mission in Libya as an important step forward ending the impunity in this country. The Commission should consider the migration and torture nexus as a priority in order to achieve a more protective framework that includes rehabilitation services and psychological support for migrants. In Nigeria recently, the End SARS campaign calling to disband the special police unit has raised the necessity to adopt a new policing system complying with the obligation and commitment of the country to end torture within the security forces. The brutal and excessive use of force by the Nigerian security forces has proven a clear disregard for the rules of engagement and professionalism, exposing a long culture of torture and lack of accountability by the Nigerian law enforcement and policing apparatus. This question is something that we can observe across the continent, especially in the context of election and peaceful protest. And this call for a discussion within the African Commission and the African states to develop a more free torture policing across the security forces of the continent. In Cameroon, that is being reviewed and that has been commended by the Commission as being the first state to submit an alternative a report on the Kampala Convention. The recent deliberate killing of children by armed groups crossed a new red line in the protracted Anglophone conflict that started in 2016 with peaceful protest. The violence has killed thousands of civilians and displaced several 100,000 people. The different armed groups, including the state authority, security forces, have systematically used torture and ill treatment, including sexual violence against civilians. The repeated calls, including the calls of the Commission to an inclusive dialogue and ceasefire, have been ignored by both warring parties. The Commission, the African Commission, is maybe the only treaty body that has followed the so-called Anglophone crisis from its beginning in 2010 in a decision. And this decision was the one that maybe today helped to resolve this crisis. The 216/2003 decision has called for a mediation that could be given through the African Commission. And we call the African Commission, sorry.
Please conclude, your time is up.
Exactly. To conclude my statement, we call the African Commission to call upon the Cameroonian state to access the country and have a mediation possibility with the state and the warring parties. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your statement relating to issues of torture that you have highlighted in various contexts, including in the context of migration. And in that respect, the call that you have made, emphasizing the importance of the Commission's initiative for undertaking a mission to Libya, and indeed also exploring the nexus between torture and migration. And I think, like others, you have also highlighted the link between problems in the security sector and the occurrence and perpetration of torture due to the nature of the deficit, the governance deficit in the security sector and very bad practices in some countries. I think it is only befitting for us to say that if there is one absolute prohibition for which there exists no justification whatsoever under any circumstance, it is the prohibition of torture. There is absolute prohibition, and it is incumbent on states to ensure that their agents, state security institutions, law enforcement agencies have zero practice of engaging in torture. This is extremely important point. We have now come to the end of the time allocated for us at this point in time for purpose of agenda item 4 on the situation of human rights in Africa. We will come back to this agenda item. I wish to call on national human rights institutions, perhaps for them to be on standby. I wish to, in this respect, in particular, call on the national human rights institutions of Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Burundi, Tanzania, Mali, and Nigeria. The national human rights institutions of these countries, please, I think it would be good if you join us in the coming days and be on standby because we will be calling you when we have agenda item 4 again. There are also a long list of NGOs whom I would wish to assure that the list is with us and you would be given the opportunities to make your statement. Thank you very much for all of you for the statements that you have delivered with us, updating us on the state of human rights in various contexts and country-specific as well as thematic issues. Now we shift gear and we will be discussing, we'll be having the item 3, which relates to panels and loans. We have here a panel on extractive industries and illicit financial flows in Africa. And this is also an occasion for us to launch the newsletter of the Working Group on Extractive Industries, Environment and Human Rights in Africa as well. Colleagues, distinguished delegates, one of the most recent developments that we have come to take note of relates to the release recently of the Economic Development in Africa report of 2020 by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. This is a report titled Tackling Illicit Financial Flows for Sustainable Development in Africa. I wish to indicate that the reason why we have chosen this panel relates to a number of considerations. One, this report, a very comprehensive report, highlights that the scourge of illicit financial flights is expanding on the African continent, and the scale of this scourge is far higher than it has been reported previously. And one of the findings in this report, which is not new also, is the fact that one of the major sources of illicit financial flows relates to the extractive industries sector. On account of the mandate that the Working Group on Extractive Industries have, and indeed this being one of the major issues that the Working Group needs to address, we thought that it is fitting for us to have this panel discussion. I wish in this respect to draw the attention of all of you, distinguished participants, to Article 21 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which is the relevant provision for purpose of the extractive industries sector. And if you look through the provisions of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, one of the things that strikes you is the fact that perhaps Article 21 is the article with the longest provisions from the rights guaranteed in the African Charter. It has 5 sub-provisions within it. And it is a manifestation of the particular significance that is attached to this subject, and indeed the historical nature of the issues that Africa had experienced as far as the exploitation and use of natural resources is concerned. For our purpose, I think it suffices for me to read the following. The first one, of course, the founding article is the one that establishes the right of all peoples to freely dispose of their wealth and natural resources. And sub-article 1 goes on to state that these rights shall be exercised in the exclusive interest of the people, in the exclusive interest of the people. In no case shall a people be deprived of it. It's also important to indicate subparagraph 5 of Article 21, which states that states parties to the present charter shall undertake to eliminate all forms of foreign economic exploitation, particularly that practiced by international monopolies. This is in the context of the right of all peoples to free disposal of their wealth and natural resources. So it is against the background of this very comprehensive provision of the African Charter that today we have the fortune to discuss the phenomena of illicit financial flows, which actually deprives Africa of a much needed resource for promoting its development aspirations and indeed needs. In the course of this session, but also previous sessions, we have highlighted how massive poverty and deepening inequality continues to strip the masses of our people of their dignity, condemning them to live a life free from access to the basic needs of life. And the continuation of illicit financial flows is indeed a very serious violation of the right of our people, not only to their natural resources, but also to the right to development under Article 22 of the African Charter. To discuss these and related issues, we have the pleasure of having with us Mr. Junior Davis. Mr. Junior Davis, very glad to see you here, and thank you very much for joining us. He is from the United Nations Development, UNCTAD, from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. He is the lead author of this 2020 report that I made reference to, Economic Development in Africa report of 2020, focusing on illicit financial flows and the kind of damage that it is causing to development and to systems of governance and human rights. You are very welcome. We also have with us the representative of the APRM with us, Dr. Mishak Mitwiz, who is joining us on behalf of the CEO of the APRM. The APRM, the Africa Peer Review Mechanism, is one of the governance institutions of the African Union, which also, among other things, addresses the issues relating to illicit financial flows as well. We also have with us the pleasure of Professor Damilola Olwai, who is the expert member of the Working Group on Extractive Industries, Environment and Human Rights. Without further ado, distinguished participants, let me give the floor first to Mr. Junior Davis. You have the floor, please. And once again, welcome.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Derson. It's a pleasure to be here. Distinguished panelists, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. The year 2020 has been one of the most challenging globally as economies face an unprecedented recession due to COVID-19. The economic toll of the pandemic is yet to be fully understood, as most countries, particularly in Africa, are still grappling with its containment as other regions and major economies enter a second wave of pandemic. Africa may only just be waking up to the devastating costs of COVID-19. It is estimated that the region will require about $154 billion to recover from the COVID-19 impacts. Notably, this financing requirement adds to the region's Sustainable Development Goals annual financing gap, $200 billion. The COVID-19 pandemic has the potential to undermine gains in social and economic development and poverty reduction achieved over the past decade. UNCTAD estimates that the number of people in least developed countries living below the poverty line of $2 a day could increase by 68 million in 2020 alone. Africa's main export destination markets and commodity prices remain depressed. Foreign direct investment to Africa is predicted to plummet by $20 billion in 2020. And overseas development assistance to Africa has stagnated for most part of a decade now at around $30 billion a year, and it is not likely to increase anytime soon. The pandemic has weakened countries' fiscal position due to lockdown measures, but also indirectly due to their exposure to international commodity and capital markets. Looming debt distress in some African countries has the potential to undermine the borrowing prospects of all African countries, as investors at international capital markets tend to exhibit herd behavior. Nonetheless, extractive commodities matter critically for the continent. They constitute more than 60% of total African exports and contribute to around 30% of African GDP. 43 out of 54 African countries depend on the export of primary commodities. Moreover, many African countries have sovereign or commercial debt obligations linked to their commodities denominated in US dollars. This further exposes them to external shocks like the global slowdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic. To better insulate against foreign shocks, countries need to retain more value from their natural resources on the continent. Over the long term, this can be achieved through greater economic diversification and processing of extractive commodities on the continent. In the medium term, better resource governance will be necessary. However, many countries are still operating below their tax potential. So in the short run, African governments will need to do more to curb illicit financial flows. Even if this is difficult in practice, as we've seen in the case of Nigeria, there is some scope for being able to recover stolen assets. And as we've seen in Zambia, taxes can be claimed back retroactively. Ladies and gentlemen, this year's Economic Development in Africa Report 2020, titled Tackling Illicit Financial Flows for Sustainable Development in Africa, which proposes policies to reduce illicit capital flights and enhance Africa's domestic resource mobilization, is timely given the continent is faced with increased fiscal constraints arising from structural vulnerabilities and a lack of capacity to deal with new and emerging challenges, as previously noted, such as COVID-19, climate change, and ongoing geopolitical tensions. All of these challenges have emerged amidst financial pressures to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2060 and Agenda 2063 within the next decade. UNCTAD defines illicit financial flows as movements of money and assets across borders which are illegal in source, transfer, or use. They include illicit capital flight, tax, and commercial practices like misinvoicing of trade shipments and criminal activities such as illegal markets, corruption, exploitation, and the financing of terrorism. The practice of fraudulent understatement of the export value and customs practice is called export underinvoicing and allows firms to lower their domestic tax burden by keeping part of the corresponding payments in foreign accounts. The report confirms that illicit financial flows are indeed a major drain of capital in Africa, mainly through trade misinvoicing, which costs Africa between $30 and $52 billion a year. Now, the risk of these illicit financial flows in Africa are mainly linked to the export of primary extractive resources, which cumulatively are estimated to have contributed to losses of up to $278 billion between 2008 and 2018. Estimated costs of corruption in Africa are $148 billion a year. This loss is more than its annual infrastructure investment needs estimated at $93 billion a year to achieve its SDG targets, and abusive tax practices. These include abusive transfer pricing, profit shifting, tax arbitraging, and tax treaty shopping. And these are the main mechanisms for tax evasion and avoidance, including also money laundering in Africa. Many of the approximately 500 bilateral tax treaties in force in Africa are at high risk of tax avoidance and are estimated to cost Africa about 20 to 26% of corporate income tax revenue from each treaty within an investment hub. The report shows that illicit financial flows linked to the export of extractive commodities from Africa is large and growing. Illicit financial flows related to the export of these extractive commodities constitute the largest component of illicit financial flows from Africa. Although estimates of illicit financial flows are large, they are based mainly on trade data, which is only available for 41 out of 54 countries, and thus understates the problem and its impact. Furthermore, illicit financial flows are concentrated in high-value, low-weight commodities like gold, which we estimate represents 77% of the total, followed by diamonds, representing 12%, and platinum, 6%. This underlines the concentration of illicit financial flows as expressed through underinvoicing of exports of high-value, low-weight commodities. There are also other metals like aluminium and iron, which are also prone to export underinvoicing, but to a lesser extent.
Sorry, Mr. Davis. I'm not sure if we have interpretation, the French interpretation, please, colleagues. If you...
Should I continue?
L'interprète parle trop bas. On n'entend pas l'interprète. Maintenant, oui.
Okay. New metals.
Colleagues, interpreters, please speak close to the mic and louder for the interpretation.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Please.
I'll try.
It's not you, it's the interpreters.
New metals like manganese, chromium, and other rare earth metals potentially exhibit the largest relative risk of illicit financial flows in relation to their export volume. The World Bank estimates that the demand for these sorts of metals used in lithium-ion energy storing batteries required for a global transition to a low carbon future might rise by as much as 1,000% by 2050. This puts African exporters of minerals and metals at high risk of suffering from illicit financial flows linked to these exports into the future, which may lead to similar patterns we have observed for traditional high-value, low-weight commodities like diamonds and gold. In this context, reviving the African mining vision is essential, as a united Africa potentially has significant market power since it holds critical reserves for metals that will be in high demand soon. Although estimates vary, the continent holds 30% of global mineral reserves, 7% of petroleum oil, and 6% of natural gas. Ladies and gentlemen, the major concern from the highlighted risks and costs of illicit financial flows is their toll on Africa's pursuit of sustainable development. In particular, the report shows that high levels of illicit financial flows are associated with low productivity, low investment, and weak institutional capacity. Low labor productivity and growth is specifically, the report finds that countries with high illicit financial flows have only 1/3 of the agricultural productivity levels of countries with low illicit financial flows. Regarding low investment levels, countries with high illicit financial flows spend 25% less on health and 58% less on education than countries with low illicit financial flows. And concerning low institutional capacity and weak financial sector regulation, only 45 out of 53 African countries provide trade data to UN Comtrade in a continuous manner, and only a fraction of these participate in the metadata survey. Furthermore, about half of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa still do not have any form of domestic transfer pricing rules and therefore cannot challenge multinational firms through local judicial authorities. So in a context where mainly low-income economies with limited state capacity is prevalent, illicit financial flows and the illicit trade in extractive resources can have an unquantifiable multiplier effect because of their propensity to undermine peace and security, which can confine an economy in a conflict trap, stalling development for decades. Cognizant of these interlinkages, illicit financial flows are grouped under Sustainable Development Goal 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. Many writers have estimated the economic impact.
Mr. Davis, in the interest of time, if you could also give us a conclusion, please.
Yes, I will be wrapping up right now. In developing countries, civil war tends to reduce economic growth by 2.3% a year. Thus, a typical 7-year conflict will leave a country 15% poorer. Thus, the relationship between illicit financial flows and conflict is twofold or circular. On the one hand, conflict and instability are considered a cause of illicit financial flows through the laundering of the proceeds of crime and poor institutional control, especially in weak institutional environments. Limited state capacity to ensure security leaves the country highly vulnerable to capital flight. On the other hand, the existence of illicit financial flows can increase state fragility and cause conflict. These conflicts may relate to illicit trade in and proliferation of arms, especially small arms and light weapons, as well as the illicit exploitation, trafficking and trade of high-value natural resources. This has devastating implications for people's prosperity, the exploitation, forced labor, and other human rights violations. For example, those articulated in UN Security Council Resolution 1596 on the DRC can be linked to the illicit extraction of resources in conflict situations. Conflicts create refugees and mass movements of people, which is particularly challenging now given the backdrop of a stressed health and care system during the COVID-19 pandemic. Better resource governance and greater transparency on trade, geo-information on natural resource reserves, and extractive sector contracts via the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative can help to identify, curb, and recover illicit financial flows linked to the export of extractive resources. I also want to point out that the AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, could usher in a new area of trade governance in Africa and provide a much needed framework for cooperation and institutional capacity to combat illicit financial flows. If we look at Annex 3 of the AFCFTA Protocol on Trade in Goods, it calls explicitly for cooperation in all areas of customs administration, mutual assistance, harmonization of tariffs and statistics, the automation and exchange of information, which are all important to tracking and combating illicit financial flows. I will conclude right now.
Yeah, can you conclude? We'll come back to you.
I will conclude right now. Joint efforts.
Let me come back to you. Let me give the opportunity to other presenters. You will make that conclusion when we come back to you.
Okay, fine.
Okay, great. Good. Do we have with us Mr. Mutse, who is the head of division of the Africa Credit Rating Agency unit of the ACHPR?
Yes, good morning.
Okay.
Good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon and welcome. Please, you have the floor. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Honorable Deso, distinguished participants and honorable panelists. On behalf of the CEO of the African Peer Review Mechanism, Professor Eddie Maloka, I welcome you. I greet you. So I'm going to speak from his notes and also convey his apologies for being unable to join this meeting because of an equally urgent commitment that he had to attend to. So I'm going to speak on the role of political, socio-economic, and corporate governance in extractive industry in addressing illicit financial flows in Africa. So the APRM also undertake a country review missions and produce comprehensive documents in the form of the country review reports, which have consistently in its finding also discovered that lack of transparency and accountability are amongst the chief reasons why resources or resource-rich African countries are underperforming economically, and also it trickles down to the socio-economic problems that we witness. And it also finds out that countries that are highly dependent on natural resources are mostly amongst the severely affected by the problem of illicit financial flow. So they end up not reaping the benefits of those natural resources because the proceeds end up benefiting the few elites. So distinguished participants, there are several factors that we have identified, which has been consistent, I think, in most of the findings that we see in comprehensive researches, that the extractive sector is prone to illicit financial flows because of a few reasons that I'm going to point out here. So firstly is because you find that the extractive sector tend to come under a high level of discretionary political control, which end up facilitating illicit financial flow. And the high concentration in the resource sector in terms of geographical location, exploitation, control of revenues, and the fact that they account for the majority of foreign earnings and fiscal revenue in many countries, makes the control of a resource sector a powerful instrument for both economic and political power. So as such, they often end up being controlled by the highest offices in every country, and also perhaps we can call them by small cadres in some circles of technocrats, and are particularly prone to secrecy. So discretionary funds generally by extractive sector increase political leaders' autonomy from the population and external donors, thereby reducing accountability and openness to reform. So the second factor or contributor is pointed as the frequent blurring of public shareholder and personal interests with regards to extractive sector, and also the state companies, especially in the oil and gas sectors, that may end up serving personal interests of their political patrons. So government officials, in some instances, they are found to have vested financial interests in companies in these sectors. And in public as well as private companies, senior management may benefit from excessive compensation packages. So the third factor is the competition, which or lack thereof, the lack of competition in those sectors, which results in fewer checks and balances compared to other competitive sectors, which find that the extractive sector usually end up having oligopolies which collaborate in those or in that level of operation. So the fourth reason could be that the extractive sectors involve complex technical and financial processes that requires a high degree of expertise, and oil companies themselves, as an example, they, rather than government, they do much of their accounting and tax payments, especially in developing countries. So this opens a door for manipulation, particularly if the auditing capacity is limited or is also corrupt, which has been witnessed mostly in this recent past. So the high reliance on taxes on profit encourages a cost of inflation and facilitates mispricing by companies. And finally, we tend to identify that the resource-rich countries tend to have a high degree of integration into the global economy, but through a limited number of channels, particularly resource exports and imports of food and manufactured goods. So these open lucrative opportunities for illicit financial flow. So to quote again from this important United Nations Conference on Trade and Development reports, the Economic Development in Africa report, an important statistics which I would reiterate is that illicit financial flows that is lost by the continent, amounting to 3.7% of the continent's GDP, leaves the continent through illicit capital flight, which is a bulk, or the bulk of those proceeds emanate from the extractive industry. So this is nearly a combined total annual inflow of the official development assistance, which is also almost the equivalent figure for foreign direct investment. So illicit financial flows thus represent a major drain on capital and revenue from the continent, undermining its productive capacity and prospects for achieving the Agenda 2063 and sustainable development goals. So the socio-economic impact is therefore on the vulnerable ones, the women and girls that often have less access to health and education, and they suffer most from negative fiscal effects of illicit financial flows. Therefore, tackling illicit financial flows represents a large potential source of capital to finance the much needed investment in infrastructure, education, health, and productive capacity. And curbing illicit financial flows could generate capital to fund a significant funding gap in the socio-economic needs of the continent. So the APRM often in its review reports also advocates for strengthening good practices in the return of assets to foster sustainable development and achieving the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development Goals. So our recommendation is therefore that it is important to develop and strengthen institutions that collect more and better trade data to detect risk related to illicit financial flows, and also to increase transparency in extractive industry and tax collection. The solutions lies in involving international corporations and anti-corruption measures. The international community should also be devoting more resources to build capacity in tackling illicit financial flows. I thank you.
Many thanks, Dr. Mutide. Again, I think sharing very useful insights from the perspective of the work of the African peer review mechanism, identifying the major factors behind illicit financial flows, which are dominant in particular in the extractive industry sector, and also what can and needs to be done in order to address illicit financial flows, and why it is so important that this scourge, which are the very devastating consequence on the development needs and aspirations of the continent, is so important. Now I have the pleasure of inviting our own member of the working group on extractive industries, Professor Olawi, to give us his insights as well. Professor Olawi, for those of you who don't know him, is a very distinguished expert on law relating to the extractive industry sector. So it's good to have him also as a member of, as a new member of the working group on extractive industries. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, the Honorable Chairperson of the African Commission, Honorable Solomon Ayele Deso, distinguished commissioners, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Building on the insightful remarks made by my co-panelists, it is my pleasure to present to you some of the work done by the Working Group on Extractive Industries, Environment and Human Rights Violation in order to address the scourge of illicit financial flows that my colleagues have been talking about, especially the need to integrate a human rights perspective in doing so. Despite Africa's abundant oil, gas, and solid mineral wealth, corresponding economic, social, and environmental development have not been easily forthcoming. Many studies continue to document a prevalence of the resource curse conundrum across the continent. Maximizing returns from Africa's huge extractive affluence is perennially undermined by financial crime and governance challenges, especially the problem of illicit financial flows. Corruption, money laundering, and tax evasion remain key problems and key routes through which funds leave Africa illicitly. So we find that, as my colleagues have mentioned, illicit financial flows are not only an economic, developmental, and tax problem, but indeed a human right problem. Resources that could be used to develop the continent have found their way out of the continent. It was in order to address these and other problems that our working group was established in 2009 to study, track, and propose measures to address the negative human rights consequences of unregulated or poorly regulated extractive industries in the continent. Now, the working group has been working extensively in order to address this problem of illicit financial flows and to provide tools that could help African countries to respect, protect, and fulfill the key provisions of Article 21 and 24 of the African Charter, which recognize the need for transparent, accountable, and sustainable management of resource wealth in order to unlock peace, progress, and prosperity across the continent. So over the last few years, the Commission has released 6 important documents that cast a direct spotlight on the roles of state parties to address illicit financial flows. In 2012, Resolution 224 on the human rights approach to natural resource governance was released, which called on states to ensure participation, access to information, non-discrimination, equality, and legality, rule of law, especially the need for free, prior, informed consent in natural resource governance. Secondly, Resolution 236 on capital flight was adopted at the Commission's 53rd Ordinary Session in 2013, which again called on state parties to examine their national tax laws and policies towards preventing illicit financial flows. Thirdly, a statement was issued by the Commission on illicit financial flight and other concerns arising out of the Paradise Papers. As we recall, the Paradise Papers is a set of 13.4 million confidential electronic documents that highlight offshore investments, some of them relating to Africa. So the statement that was issued called on state parties to assess their national tax laws and to make necessary amendments to prevent weak governance. Number 4 is Resolution 367 on the Niamey Declaration, which was issued in 2017 at the 60th Ordinary Session of the Commission, which again called on state parties to institute laws where they do not exist in order to ensure accountability, transparency, and participation in resource management. Number 5 is the state reporting guidelines that the working group and the commission have worked on, which give guidelines on how countries can monitor and track progress made in addressing problems relating to illicit financial flows and other problems relating to lack of transparency in the extractive industry. And most recently, the working group has put together a draft report titled The Human Rights-Based Approach to Addressing Illicit Financial Flows from Africa. And this report discusses exactly why a human rights perspective on illicit financial flows is important. Without a human rights perspective, extractive activities risk exacerbating human rights violations in host countries. Whether we are talking of the right to development, equality, peace, education, property, none of these human rights can be achieved in an atmosphere of corruption, because the funds needed to develop key sectors might leave the continent. The report therefore highlights the obligations of states relating to human rights. And the report focuses on the fact that these obligations are of two types. There is a positive obligation and a negative obligation. The positive obligation relates to the need for states to enact legislation and to establish rules and guidelines that can ensure the protection of human rights through transparent, accountable, and participatory approaches to resource governance. While the negative obligation relates to the need for states to refrain from enacting laws and policies or from entering into bilateral agreements or double tax agreements that may compromise their ability to take legislative and other steps to improve tax collection and to improve transparency and accountability. So some of the work of the working group emphasize the need, the roles of state parties, which includes, of course, strengthening capacity to address illicit financial flows, undertaking tax spillover assessments, especially to ensure that tax are monitored and collected as of when due, and they need to investigate and take actions to repatriate funds in relation to those Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers and such other exposes that we've seen. And of course, there is a need for state parties to also engage with regulatory bodies in order to improve ethical standards. And of course, I should mention the roles of non-state actors as well to ensure due diligence and human rights impact assessment in every transaction in order to prevent human rights violations. So the Commission, through the working group, will continue to monitor and recommend steps that can help state parties and non-state actors to address the problem of illicit financial flows. I thank you very much.
Many thanks to you, Professor Alawi, for providing us with that expose on the work that has been undertaken by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights through the working group on extractive industries, environment, and human rights. The work clearly recognizes the gravity of the situation and the imperative for addressing this issue. And it does so with a clear recognition and appreciation that this has very direct and serious human rights implications. It is from that perspective that we look at how effectively to operationalize Article 21 and the standards under Article 21, particularly in terms of creating a very robust fiscal, monetary, regulatory frameworks whose weakness or absence, as have been highlighted by the panelists, is one of the major sources of this problem. And also establishing and creating accountability mechanisms, and indeed doing so in a manner that is participatory and that is transparent. Transparency and participation are key in terms of ensuring that the public has full knowledge of the kind of transactions that are being conducted. And that obviously requires both transparency and, of course, the participation of members of the public. I think quite a very rich inputs have been provided to us using both the report of UNCTAD, but also the work that African governance institutions such as the APRM and our own the African Commission are doing in order to deal with this scourge. Now I think we can open the floor for reflections, comments, and questions. So I invite colleagues, members of the Commission, for your reflections and inputs. Also, participants, if you also wish to share with us, states parties, NHRIs, and civil society organizations, that is also most welcome. Yes, Commissioner Hattem.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Prenons la parole pour la première fois ce matin. Je souhaite la bienvenue et la bonne journée à Messieurs les représentants des États, à mes chers collègues commissaires, aux intervenants de ce panel, aux amis du secrétariat et de la cabine. Monsieur le Président, je voudrais d'abord faire une remarque que nous avons partagée entre nous, commissaires, par téléphone. C'est un peu pénible de suivre ce riche débat. C'est un problème technique. Nous avons deux voix dans nos micros. C'est-à-dire que pour les francophones, nous avons la voix originale en anglais plus le français. Alors, on a été obligé soit d'éteindre l'interprétation pour pouvoir suivre en anglais, parfois un mot nous échappe, soit avoir deux voix. C'est un problème technique. Il faut que la voix de l'interprète soit la voix dominante. Il faut réduire, arrêter l'original. Ça, c'est un point technique qui sera réglé. Je remercie tous les amis panélistes pour ce riche panel, pour le sujet très, très intéressant. Et je m'excuse, moi, j'aurais intitulé ce panel non pas comment vous l'avez intitulé, les industries extractives ou les activités extractives et les flux financiers illicites. Les flux, est-ce que nous nous intéressons plus aux flux financiers illicites ou aux industries extractives? Parce qu'il y a un aspect qui n'a pas été très bien abordé, bien que le reste soit excellent par tous les orateurs. Les flux financiers illicites ne proviennent pas uniquement de l'industrie extractive. Les flux financiers intéressent beaucoup d'activités. C'est vrai, ce qui a été dit n'est pas faux. On sait que les industries extractives, pétrole, mines, diamants, or, etc., autour de ces activités-là, il y a beaucoup de flux financiers illicites. Mais dans certains pays, il y a les flux financiers qui proviennent des richesses de ces pays-là. Et je m'explique. J'ai eu la chance d'avoir connu un éminent professeur en droit qui a travaillé aux Nations Unies et qui a été dans la Commission nationale tunisienne contre la corruption. Alors, les grands barons du tourisme, que ce soit en Tunisie ou ailleurs, je ne veux pas citer de pays, profitent de ces échanges internationaux, de ces milliards brassés par l'industrie touristique pour installer des systèmes de flux financiers illicites, bien sûr. Les marchés également, où les gens travaillent dans des industries, ce qui est appelé les activités offshore, où il y a des régimes sous douane. là également, il y a beaucoup de flux financiers illicites. Et donc, le sujet est plus vaste que les industries extractives, qui, bien sûr, elles, sont, si vous voulez, la plus voyante dans ce domaine-là. Donc, c'est une simple invite à élargir le débat pour s'intéresser aux flux financiers illicites d'une façon générale et qui touche donc l'Afrique d'une façon flagrante et sans oublier également les marchés publics qui parfois font l'objet de flux financiers illicites, de capitaux qui restent en dehors du continent et qui ne reviennent pas. Et parfois, ces capitaux sont plus importants que ceux qui profitent même à des marchés mal faits dans nos pays. Voilà, c'est la remarque que je voulais faire. Je remercie encore une fois tous les panélistes, tous les intervenants pour ce débat qui sera passionnant. Je vous rends la parole, Monsieur le Président.
Many thanks, Commissioner Hatem. Really a very important dimension that needs to be looked at. May I request Atwell and colleagues in the technical team to please address the interference of the original speaker with the translation, please. I think it is interfering with the good conduct of the proceedings that Commissioner Hatem highlighted. Thank you very much again, Commissioner Hatem. I'm sure our colleagues, members of the panel, have taken due note of that very important contribution. Commissioner Manuela.
Muito bom dia, Sr. Presidente. Bom dia a todos os presentes nesta sala, membros dos Estados, das INDH, das ONGs, do secretariado e dos nossos ilustres intérpretes que permitem esta interação. Estão a ouvir-me? Muito bem. Devo começar. Devo começar por parabenizar os panelistas que nos trouxeram excelentes reflexões, extratos daquilo que é o relatório sobre o desenvolvimento econômico em África do CNUCED, das Nações Unidas. Isto leva-me a concordar ou fazer minhas as palavras do colega Hatem quando diz que esses fluxos não devem ser situados apenas na indústria extrativa. Porque até na indústria de construção civil, nos contratos que são feitos para construir em África, até nisto se refletem grandes fluxos financeiros ilícitos. Porque, por vezes, esse dinheiro nunca chega à África. À África chega o pior material de construção, de pior qualidade, mas que é pago aos preços que todo mundo conhece. Mas também a minha reflexão leva-me exatamente ao impacto desses fluxos na vida do africano, que é aquele que mais sente que aquilo que lhe é devido é usufruído noutro quadrante do mundo. E a população africana fica com as consequências nefastas. Mas isto tudo é feito aos olhos daqueles que efetivamente deveriam proteger a população africana. Disse bem um dos oradores, acredito do Marco, que isto é feito com o beneplácito dos governantes, que criam equipas para se protegerem, para poderem criar essa falta de transparência, porque isto é propositado. É propositado não ter dados, é propositado não relatar, para não permitir que sejam responsabilizados, que sejam indagados sobre o destino daquilo que efetivamente pertence a todos. E, infelizmente, nos nossos países que dependem completamente desse tipo de indústrias, que recebem todo tipo de cooperação, pretexto por vezes de cooperação, porque a nível local e numa relação sul-sul, era possível fazer as mesmas coisas. Era possível fazer as mesmas coisas. Era possível construir estradas, era possível construir cidades, era possível fazer isso tudo a nível do sul-sul. Mas interessa a relação, de longe, porque os valores vão para paraísos fiscais, e é isto que deve estar ali nos relatórios. Quem são os últimos destinatários desses valores que saem de África, desses fluxos financeiros ilícitos? A elite africana, desde o primeiro momento, está comprometida com isto. Então, já foram encontrados os problemas, já foram indicadas as soluções, agora cabe aos africanos encontrar a forma de colocar essas soluções no papel. Por que procurarmos desgraça? De onde vem a desgraça de África se ela está aqui dentro? Por que não potenciar a juventude para que esse conhecimento que se está perdendo no mar Mediterrâneo não fique em África, caso haja algum incentivo para essa juventude ficar e poder dedicar-se à África? Eu penso que foi uma reflexão muito bem feita, é um painel riquíssimo, deve ser melhorado com outras fontes de fluxos financeiros, porque foi bem dito que há uma classe que beneficia, infelizmente. E fico por aqui para não colocar questões políticas que não interessam a ninguém. Obrigada.
Obrigado, Commissioner Manuela, really for that another excellent contribution on this very important subject, highlighting in particular the other areas of illicit financial flows, such as the construction sector, but really nailing it on the impact of these transactions on Africans and what is it that we as Africans need to do, particularly given the role of and how compromised African elites are. Many thanks for that, Commissioner Manuel. I'm sure colleagues have taken due note of those very important insights. Any other requests from the floor? All right. I don't see any other requests from colleagues. Right. Yeah. Okay. I'm confirming. Okay. Yeah. I don't see any requests from anyone. I don't see either any confirmation of requests for the floor from states parties, from NHRIs or civil society organizations. So let's go back to members of the panel. Mr. Junior Davis, if you can come back and address those extremely important observations that have been made, that basically, yes, the extractive industry sectors can be a major area of concern, but the phenomena is pervasive in other areas of the economic life of our societies as well. And of course, what that means in terms of the question of who are actually the culprits, so to speak, and what role and responsibility do we attribute to African governments, to African elites, and of course, ultimately, of course, the question of the impact these have on ordinary people You have the floor, please. And of course, you can make final points that I interrupted you earlier on. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Diaz. So I'll be brief. Thank you very much for the questions. I would say that the reason we have focused on the extractive sector in the context of trying to look at the scale of illicit financial flows is partly a function of the lack of data. So we can get trade data, and you can get data from the balance of payments when you're looking at capital flight and measuring whether more capital is leaving than should be leaving a given economy. But speaking more to the issues that were raised around the issue of governance, I would like to make maybe 3 points. One is the extractive sector. Most African countries are commodity dependent. So, and where we see most foreign direct investment in Africa being targeted is precisely in the extractive sectors. And that is where you find the biggest multinationals are most active. That is not to say, because there are other channels, there's the financial services sector, for example, is also an important channel for illicit financial flows. But given the structure of most African economies and its weight towards extractive sectors, this and the data issues that I mentioned before, this is where we see most of the activity. Also, the extractive sector is subject to different and multiple layers of legislation at the domestic level. And what we did when we reviewed the existing bilateral agreements that underpin many of the extractive sector mining contracts, for example, is that when you look across the continent, there is no coordinated approach to fiscal issues in mineral producing countries, despite the importance of this to African economies. You also find that in most African countries, I think the exceptions were just South Africa and Kenya, there is no mechanism through which they can legally, through domestic law or through their own local judicial authorities, actually address issues of tax evasion with multinational firms. It's very difficult for them to do this, partly because they don't have any domestic transfer pricing regime. And that tackling illicit financial flows isn't just a national issue, it's a multilateral issue. It involves multiple actors. Now, in the report, we tried to speak to one or two human rights issues in the context of measuring the effects of illicit financial flows on health, on education, and to a degree on the movement of people. And as I mentioned earlier, the results of that analysis are quite striking in terms of the greatly reduced available resources for expenditure on promoting health and education, and also some of the outcomes in terms of child under 5 mortality that we discuss in the report. I guess I would conclude by simply saying that we need to see more and stronger joint efforts by African policymakers and other relevant stakeholders if Africa is serious about tackling this problem. It's one of the reasons why I mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Area, because I think in the area of the negotiation around services, around the investment protocols, and also in some of the rules I discussed earlier under Annex 3 concerning trade in goods and services, there are continental-wide mechanisms which, if implemented, could really help to tackle this problem at its source in the country. I think also, it's important that state officials, and particularly customs authorities, treat wide and persistent trade gaps for these very, very commodities where they see anomalies they must be investigated. But to do that requires better quality data and capacity for collecting it at personnel, at ports, and with customs and tax authorities. I think African countries also need to be more effective at sharing trade and tax data, and to align regulations on sectors that are particularly high risk of illicit financial flows. And we know what these are. They aren't just extractives, although that's probably the biggest contributor, but we see it in telecommunications, and we also see it in financial services. We didn't talk about that very much today because of the title of the topic, but we also see it there. So it's important that African countries join transparency initiatives, such as the Open Budget Initiative, the Collaborative African Budget Reform Initiative, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And also, I think it's important that they support the APRM and the ATAF in tackling these issues and providing greater advocacy at the multilateral level to address these problems, because it's a multilateral issue. It's not just African firms involved, obviously. It's also important, I think, to rekindle trust in multilateralism. You know, multilateralism globally has been under attack for some time, and I think in many ways the African Union has led the way in rekindling and pushing multilateralism with its progress in delivering on the African Continental Free Trade Area, which I hope will be implemented next year through tangible actions. And I think it's also important that Africa engages more with multinational firms on responsible tax issues as they arise within the OECD framework. You know, under the base erosion program and others, you know, Africa has to be much more present there if it is to affect the change we need to see in these countries. And I'll stop there. Thank you, sir.
Many thanks again, Mr. Davis, for those very insightful responses to the questions raised. I think I would now move to Dr. Mutze. I think it would be good if you could also reflect, for example, I think from the perspective of UNCTAD as well. You made reference to the ACHPR, you made reference to the African mining vision. I think if we could do a mapping of African institutional responses and mechanisms that can have contribution to addressing this scourge. Certainly, I think it would be good to add the APRM, but also, of course, our own the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, because of the fact that there is explicit reference on the imperative and the need for ensuring that natural resources, very effective natural resource governance in Africa for the betterment of the well-being and development of Africa. So I thought that is a point worth reflecting in the reports and discussions of UNCTAD as well. I think, of course, I am advertising for the Commission, understandably, but I'm doing so with the understanding that the Commission is indeed seized with this matter. And as my colleague, Professor Olawi indicated, we have Resolution 367 of the Commission, which basically in great detail outlines not only where the gaps are, but also who plays what role, and indeed the kinds of measures that need to be undertaken. And not to mention, of course, not to forget mentioning also the state reporting guidelines and principles of the African Commission on Articles 21 and 24 of the African Charter, whose copies we will definitely bring to your attention as well. May I now invite Dr. Mutide for your final reflections.
Thank you, Honorable Deso, for such an insightful moderation. So, although I'm not an expert in the matters, but I hope my interventions will suffice. So, from the perspective of the African peer review mechanism, we indeed, when we look at the correlation between the availability of resources and also the statistics like the per capita GDP, you can see that indeed the correlation is concerning, and pointing out to one of the outcomes that we have also witnessed is that when those statistics are in the far west end, that's what you see as one of the architectures of conflict in different environments. So on the issue of legislations, conventions, and protocols, I must say that the conventions, they are quite a number and very effective. But what you find lacking, or what you find is a bit limiting, is the extent to which they are implemented and enforced. So indeed, the issue of effectively enforcing them and implementing them is one of the areas that we find as limiting. So with that, I think I will just conclude my my intervention with those remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mutide, for that as well. I think we, at the African Commission, look forward to indeed engage with the APRA on this in pursuing the follow-up to this issue on addressing the illicit financial flows in Africa. Professor Alawi.
Thank you very much, the Chairperson. I just want to say that one of the key issues that African countries have been facing over the years is the absence of information on what could be done on a progressive manner, rather, to address this problem of illicit financial flows. And I think in the perspectives of, from the perspectives of the working group, what we've been doing is to prepare a newsletter that can provide periodic information of source of instruments and the approaches that could be taken in order to address illicit financial flows and many other problems facing the extractive sector. So I want to encourage everyone to integrate, to subscribe or pay attention rather to the newsletter and see the information that are contained therein. And of course, to also engage with the work of the working group. If there is any useful information or approach that could be taken, then we could integrate that into the newsletter as well, just as a way of reducing this information deficit. I believe with good information, we can turn the corner and ensure that we fully dismantle illicit financial flows across the continent. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for drawing attention to what we are going to do next, which is basically the launch of the newsletter. But let me just sum up with the following points. In the presentation from Mr. Davis, we were provided with the context in which we are discussing the scourge of illicit financial flows in Africa. And this context, for example, among other things, relate to the huge financing deficit that Africa faces as far as the funding of its development objectives is concerned. Among others, the deficit relating to the infrastructural development needs of the continent. On top of that, we now face, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, whose impact and the full scale of the impact are yet to be known, is creating, under current estimates, as Mr. Davis indicated, $154 billion demand for Africa to recover from the devastating consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. These are actually consequences which we, in our resolution 449, highlighted, particularly the humanitarian and socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19. Perhaps more than the health consequence, that is the most dire outcome of COVID-19 for us. So it is in this very dire context of funding needs of the continent that we are witnessing this scourge of illicit financial flows, which actually deprives the continent of tens of billions of US dollars. This is basically without taking into account areas in respect of which there is no information, because it's only about 43 or 45 member states who are providing data on trading, of which there are still major issues that have been highlighted. And therefore, the fact that you have this context, this level of the bleeding of the continent by through various means of taking resources out of the continent. You, on the other hand, have a lot of issues relating to the socioeconomic needs of the continent, which, as Commissioner Manuela highlighted, leads, it's not because Africa is poor, but because the opportunities are robbed of by illicit financial flows. The youth have to walk out of the continent, risk their lives, and die either en route to cross the Mediterranean or on the Mediterranean itself, making that basically a major grave site for many youths on the continent. So these are the dire situations we are witnessing. And it's interesting also to take note of the fact that there is a very interesting connection between countries with huge natural resource endowment and instability and conflict. And that nexus between peace or lack of peace and illicit financial flows in countries with natural resource endowment continues to keep these countries in a vicious cycle where they couldn't be able to regulate, but at the same time remain in a cycle of violence and corruption. And indeed, the prospect is even very frightening. Why frightening? Because we are transitioning into a world economy that relies heavily on some of the rare minerals whose major source is here in Africa, such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And there we have been reminded that illicit financial flows may increase in respect of these areas by as much as 1,000% if nothing is done to curb this scourge. So, colleagues, honorable members of the Commission, distinguished delegates, what we are discussing and what we have presented today is one of the most serious issues whose scale and the damage that it causes doesn't often and ordinarily make news. Is not something that we always indeed put up front in our conversations and discussions about human rights. But today's discussion, I think, has shed light on not only the scale and magnitude of illicit financial flows, but also the devastating consequence that it causes, not only in the extractive sector, as Commissioner Hatem rightly pointed out, but also in many other areas of public life, relating to procurement, relating to contracting, particularly involving international contract. And this issue obviously requires the collective work and responsibility of all of us. States parties to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, of course, they bear primary responsibility. And they need, therefore, to do all that needs to be done in that respect. But I wish to also include, as Professor Olawi indicated, and as also Commissioner Manuela, that we need also to empower African communities. We need to empower civil society organizations and ensure that they have increased engagement, increased role, in order to enhance transparency, in order to create the legal infrastructure necessary so that countries would create the conditions for individuals who are affected by these phenomena to take multinational companies to court at the national level. As Mr. Davis indicated, there are 2 or so countries where that is possible at the moment. All right. And of course, we have to address the issue of international bilateral trade agreements, which actually lock countries, African countries, out of the possibility of effectively regulating this sector. And the multilateral dimension that have been highlighted, which relates to, of course, the need for an international tax regime and cooperation. And Africa's participation in this is so imperative and critical. I think with that, given what has been already said, we need to take away with the fact that this is one of the structural issues, the driver of some of the losses, the major losses that Africa experiences, which also undermines governance because it perpetuates corruption. It also undermines development and indeed the well-being of our societies. Thank you once again to all the panelists for providing us with this extremely rich and very insightful perspectives on a subject, as colleagues commissioner said, so important for us to be seized with and to continue to address. Now, finally, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished participants, it gives me a great pleasure to launch the 3rd edition of the newsletter of the Working Group on Extractive Industries, Environment and Human Rights in Africa. This 3rd edition consists of course, some of the issues that we have just discussed. We have a reflection on exactly the theme of this panel, among other things. It also covers issues relating to COVID-19 and the COVID-19 and the extractive industries sector. It also provides summaries of some latest developments from member states relating to the extractive industries sector. Human rights norms to address IFF, which Professor Olawayu already presented to us. And then we also have a country profile. And this country profile for this year relates to the Republic of Botswana. We actually presented in this newsletter the extract from the keynote lecture that President Masisi delivered during the Africa Human Rights Day that we have convened on 21 October. So there is a very rich material for all of you. I wish you to join me in launching the 3rd edition of the newsletter of the Working Group on Extractive Industries, Environment and Human Rights. Kindly find the link of the newsletter on the website of the Commission. There I see Abiola also raising a printed copy, so I have only the front page, as you can see. But I invite you to go and check online. And once COVID-19 is over, of course, we can avail the printed copy also of the newsletter to all of you. I think one last thing that I wish to do, I mean, not by way of advertising or anything, but some of the questions, I think a very insightful observation that Commissioner Manuela made. Commissioner Manuela said, we shouldn't go anywhere in order to understand why we are having this problem, that the problem primarily lies with us, with the African elite, okay? And indeed, the deliberate effort of the African elite to keep the management of natural resources secret. And this is described by one major author in this sector as constituting what is called the looting machine. The looting machine. I invite you to read this book, The Looting Machine. I'm sure I see Mr. Davis smiling. I'm sure you know this book, The Looting Machine. It is an extraordinary, mind-blowing account of the kind of actors that are involved in the looting of this continent. From multinational companies engaged in the extractive industry sector to national elites that have been made, to whom reference have been made, to what are called intermediaries and middlemen, to financial services, to lawyers, and some of even the international organizations whom I don't wish to name in this context. All right. So it is against this background that we say, let's mobilize for severing the wall of illicit financial flows and ensure that Africa, and indeed the people of Africa, in accordance with Article 21 of the Charter, benefit fully from the natural resources of the continent and achieve and live a life of dignity because they are entitled to it and they deserve it. Thank you all very much for your kind attention. This brings us to the end of this 7th day of the session of the 67th Ordinary Session of the African Commission. We thank you very much for joining us and accompanying us. Tomorrow we will be proceeding with the next agenda items relating to particularly activity reports of members of the Commission. And time permit, we may also be able to entertain agenda item 4 on the situation of human rights as well. And we also, of course, have panel tomorrow as well. So, honorable members of the Commission, distinguished delegates of states parties, national human rights institutions, and civil society organizations, dear colleagues, staff of the Secretariat, and interpreters, I thank you very much and wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you. Asante sana. Shukran. Obrigado. Merci beaucoup.